Atalia Omer is a religion, conflict, and peace studies professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And how do you pronounce, is it the Keough School? Got it. Okay. The
It's
Keough School.
Irish.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She also recently served as a senior fellow and Dermot T.J. Dunphy visiting professor at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative at Harvard University's Religion and Public Life program. She earned her PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Politics from the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University. And among other publications, she is the author of Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building, When Peace Is Not Enough, How the Israeli Peace Camp Thinks About Religion, Nationalism, and Justice, and Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, which will be the primary focus of our conversation tonight. Um, so again, Atalia, thank you so much for being with us. Your book, The Days of Awe, which anyone who's registered, I've sent a link to for it as well. I found to be just incredible. The work that we're doing here at the ACJ to root back in to the prophetic Judaism of early reform is something that's kind of been forgotten in the American Jewish psyche, because after the 1940s, although some people still use the language of prophetic Judaism in the Reform movement, it mostly turned towards focusing on peoplehood and Zionism, both of which are nationalist conceptions of what it means to be Jewish as the core underpinning for Reform Judaism. And one of the things that was most exciting to me about your book was this idea that the prophetic is somehow re-emerging almost spontaneously right now. And not right now, but for the past decade or so, in the Palestinian liberation and solidarity movements within the Jewish world. Um, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the connection with that and the early reform movement, if you think there is one.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Andy. Nice to be here and to be a part of the conversation that you've been hosting. I really enjoyed the previous two that you had this year, and I'm really happy to be here. So, with respect to the prophetic, so in this book, Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, that was mostly an ethnographic work. Where I was really interested in, sociologically, I was interested in understanding what kind of processes went into the various, my various interlocutors who are differently situated along a spectrum of positions, denominations, and so forth. Perhaps we can talk about it. But I was very interested in um, how they kind of changed their what is called affective loyalty, how they unlearned Zionism. And the language of unlearning is not something I imposed on them. This is something that continuously came up in in-depth interviews. And often people describe this process of unlearning as a very painful process of, and I really want to name it, acknowledge it. And I really tried to, also in the book, really and also research and scholarship and other writings that I've done after the book was published, really to acknowledge the painful process of unlearning. It
Sure.
also involves unlearning innocence, a sense of as part of the unlearning of Zionism, there is this aspect of it. And it also so in general, what my finding is that the various activists, the interlocutors that I've engaged with, uh, as part of their process of unlearning, was not only to recognize that they did not want to associate with Zionism, or with looking at, in a very relational way, looking at the realities of Palestinians and understanding that somehow the realities of occupation, apartheid, and now I really want to name the fact that we are speaking in the midst of an ongoing genocide in Gaza. Recognizing this, it was very relational in a sense of direct responsibility for the realities of Palestinians, that something is being done in their name, in our name, and it has to change. And so there is a lot of kind of digging into the tradition, including history, in the plural, the histories, Jewish histories, in order to recover kind of a sense of Jews being not on the side of power and domination, and complicity and violence, but Jews being on that in the tradition of civil disobedience,
Sure.
the anti-apartheid struggle. So all those narratives and stories are kind of retrieved. And of course, the civil rights movement, although around the context of civil rights and Jewish involvement in that, there is also a lot of kind of critical discourse in the sense of really challenging the kind of romanticization around this particular chapter. So really
Sure.
owning up also to various other processes that we need to wrestle with, of how Jews became white, and of course not all Jews. So there is a lot of engagement with
Right.
Jews who are not white, and the kind of centering marginalized voices, Arab Jews and Black Jews, and so forth,
Wi-
as part of the process. Yeah.
So within that kind of context of the process of what it meant to go through, like, and frankly, I did that, right? I grew up really deeply embedded in Zionist institutions, in a Reform synagogue where Zionism was a core constituent part of Jewishness, um, not distinguished from the rest of Jewishness, right? And I went on the kinds of trips that you go on when you're a kid, like on Alexander Muss. I did 2.5 months there. And then just through engagement, both through college and then grad school, and then actually physically spending time in Israel, I too experienced that unlearning process, right? And in some ways you can choose it, in some ways you don't choose it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Um, and I wonder, just within the kind of um, conceptual frame of Jewish prophecy, of what it means to be a prophet in the Bible and beyond, how are you using that word in this instance? What does that mean in this like kind of context for you?
Yeah. Really important question. I'll try to be brief, because I mean there is so much to think
Right.
with. So I mean there is a sense. I mean, and also to return to your first question, there is a sense of the urgency of the moment, and this is where the relationality aspect really comes in. That it's important to note. I mean, there is kind of a digging into those other kind of like what you might call the counter archives of Jewish histories and the Jewish tradition,
Hmm.
outside the consolidation of Zionism, political Zionism, as um, uh, the dominant frame that we cannot think outside of, presumably. So there is a lot of digging and recognizing of this deeper histories in order kind of a sense of reclaiming. But this reclaiming is not only in the movement. And again, I really want to underscore the fact that a lot of my thinking emerged through the ethnography. I didn't come with like an agenda,
Sure.
and I learned so much from my interlocutors and from kind of immersing myself in those spaces and the process of unlearning. So this is where the relationality is really important. That part of that, it's not about connecting to something that was before and somehow Jewish history derailed or got perverted somehow, and now we need to reclaim, to go historically and reconnect with this tradition, because there is this reconnecting to various traditions, like I mentioned even a little bit earlier, but also that we need to confront directly the historical moment and the reality of Jewish power and domination, and also that involves really wrestling with violent, violent motifs in the Jewish tradition and Jewish history,
Sure.
including in the, for instance, like the revenge fantasies that are now really manifest themselves with, the tradition of Amalek and so forth. So, but in the context of the ethnographic work, the way in which I kind of come into the language of the prophetic is, yes, of course, there is this notion of speaking truth to power, confronting the activists, the interlocutors that I've traced in the book, are so reach in the process of the unlearning, they reach a moment of outrage in reference to their institutions, their teachers, that who lied to them, who didn't let
Sure.
them ask questions, who shut down the questions, who indoctrinated them. So there is a lot of, so I trace in the book that the outrage, and outrage is a very generative emotion. So I trace how that operates, and within that process of this ethical outrage, there is that connecting to the tradition and thinking about them relationally in the moment, but also very much intersectionally. This is kind of the other dimension of the analysis, where other kind of sources, including analysis of race and racism, and the whole conversation about how Jews became white and so forth, interrogation of Orientalism, and so all these aspects go into the unlearning, and so there is kind of digging into the tradition of the prophets, maybe, and we can put kind of like maybe in parentheses that in some cases that invocation of the prophetic resembles very much Christian reading of the prophetic, which can be, and should be problematized in the context of Jewish critique, but not to kind of like flirt with some sort of supersessionism, but
Sure.
but in my book, I kind of articulate this concept of the prophetic pastiche,
Uh-huh.
that really focuses on the dynamics of social movement, not like a prophet that emerges, a leader that
Right.
generates action, but it's the social movement. And in order to understand the social movement, and how Jews, the Jews are just one part of a broader social movement. And that there is a lot of cross learning within the social movement, and what Palestine and the liberation of Palestinians signify within that social movement. So this goes into the process of kind of this prophetic pastiche, and pastiche refers to kind of imitate. I mean, it's not just mere imitation, but it has kind of this like self-transformative edge, which is where exactly it's not about reclaiming something that is gone. It's really understanding it kind of dynamically and relationally as part of this elastic space of social movement, because Jews are not, and it's in that space that is relational, and relational with respect to as a Jew, what do I owe Palestinians?
Mhm.
And so there is a notion of tshuva,
Sure.
atonement, and that does connect to sinfulness, and acknowledging of chet, of wrongdoing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very relational, but we cannot understand it only in that relationality. We also need to bring kind of the intersectional prism into that space, because the Judaism, the Jewishness that is imagined and is rescripted within the social movement space, is multiracial, multigender. It has a really robust analysis of racism and racialization, and how Jews
Yeah.
became racialized and so forth. So this is where the kind of the prophetic pastiche refers to that social movement space.
Yeah. There's so much there. This is why I love this book, because there are so many valences within it that remind me, just because like I'm a rabbi instead of an academic, of all of these different aspects of both Jewish literature and Jewish history, right? Like the idea of outrage as being core to it. I mean, Abraham Joshua Heschel defined the prophet as a person who feels fiercely, right, and can't contain the moral outrage they have. And like, he didn't make that up. If you just
And
read,
you pray
Mhm.
with your legs, right?
Right, yes, 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 and he felt that Abraham Joshua Heschel, for those who don't know, was a rabbi who taught at all kinds of different seminaries in America. He was brought over from Germany by Hebrew Union College during World War II to help him escape the Holocaust, and is most famous for his social justice work, both in regard to civil rights in America, but also he was a very avid protester of the Vietnam War, which is a piece that often gets left out about him because the rest of the Jewish world was less pleased with that piece. Um, and he focused very heavily on the way in which even a religious and spiritual reading of the Bible would lead one to feel the necessity of confronting injustice wherever you are, right? And this was a man that was not brought up a Reform Jew. He was brought up in a long, long line of Hasidic Orthodox rabbis. But so there's that piece to it that I think is really fascinating, using the language of tshuva, of repentance, um, uh, and of feeling hate, is also interesting and something I want to come back to in a minute. But the thing that I find most fascinating about the multiracial nature and the nature of the Jewishness or Judaism that's being pictured in these social justice Jewish spaces that are in solidarity with Palestinian liberation is one that transcends all other categories, right? It lifts the participants out of um, I would suggest, out of the core definitions of being part of a Jewish nation, or being part of just a singular Jewish people, because when you actually come into these spaces of solidarity that include Jews of all kinds of backgrounds and include people who aren't Jewish at all, but who are share the same values, you start to experience this aspect of Judaism that can't be contained within the modern categories of nation or race or culture or religion. It is this, and it is through um, another the pastiche, as you said, like the kind of enactment of this behavior that echoes throughout Jewish history that one could call prophetic. And also, you talk a little bit about, I can't remember the phrase now. It comes from Durkheim, the effervescence, the
Collective effervescence.
yes, collective effervescence that I think is integrally related
Mhm.
to this idea of the prophetic, in which one embodies their outrage, embodies their feeling of the necessity to make change in a world that feels unjust through a Jewish lens. But then when multiple people do it together, it does something else, right? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is very important point because so in the book, and I continue even after the book is, was published in 2019, and it really actually my research for the book has really helped me understand and trace and analyze the kind of Jewish mobilization in the US, so Jewish American mobilization in the aftermath of October 7th and against the genocide, against arming Israel and all this, and where Jews showed up, have been showing up as Jewish and American with what that entails. But yeah, so I was interested in the emotion of outrage and tracing tracing how, and of course it's not like emotions, as we all know, are not just, they're not instinctive. It's not necessarily the case that one will be outraged by seeing, piles of killed babies. That's obviously not
No,
instinctive for
no.
people. So emotions are not instinctive. In order to even feel the emotion of outrage, of an ethical outrage, this kind of unlearning has to happen.
Mhm.
Because like you said, that line that one hears a lot, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I actually don't think that it's necessarily true.
Mm.
And although once someone one really see it, then yes.
Yeah.
But there are so many mechanisms, and I trace, and we all, I'm sure, familiar, and Rabbi Andy, you are very familiar with the mechanisms of cognitive that want to ensure cognitive dissonance,
Right.
so
Yeah.
that people will not see, will
Right.
not be outraged. And so the emotion of outrage is very generative, and this is where I engage, or I find help in social movement theory, and specifically social movement theory that focuses on emotions in social movements. And specifically, I'm looking at James Jasper's work on really kind of like this notion of the battery, the negative emotion and the positive emotion. And this is what I trace a lot in my interviews, and my also participant observation work. Like I join actions in the West Bank with American Jews and different other actions in the US, and really try to immerse myself. And I continue to try to immerse myself, and after the book. But for many people, the undoing of that cognitive dissonance, and showing up, and having that experience of the of the outrage is critical for this showing up as Jews. But in that moment of showing up, there is also a process that the positive of the other kind of Jewishness, Judaism, being Jewish, that is, it's not only this is not my Judaism, but also the question, what is my Judaism? And I'm enacting it now by showing up, by being there, by doing protective presence, by doing taking directives from Palestinians, by in the West Bank, by doing the work of co-resistance, by shaming the Jewish establishment in the US, using the language of Jewish values that they taught me, and pointing it in their faces. So what I've traced is how contestation of how to reaching out to the tradition in order to kind of to show up in the protest, but then to what degree, and there is wrestling with this point, and Rabbi Andy, we spoke about it earlier today, of to what degree the Jewish tradition becomes kind of tools, what in the language of social movement, again, it's like repertoire of protest. And this is, will be particularly effective in a particular moment if you want to protest against, Jewish institutions or Zionist institutions like IPAC or and whatnot, or now with the current moment, which is nothing new, it's just escalated, of the
Right.
weaponization of the language about Jewish safety, and weaponization of anti-Semitism. So to show up as Jews and say, well, this is not, you are cynically using, the discourse about my safety. So there's more. So the question is how, to what degree there is the tradition and the very kind of the physicality, the materiality of Jewish people is used instrumentally for protest, and to what degree that doing the protest and acting the protest in and of itself is a form of rescripting the Jewish tradition. And for many people, like in my interviews and my ethnographic work, many of them said, this is, in the act of protest itself, I rewrite, I participate, I feel Jewish and fully Jewish. And this is also meaningful spiritually, and whatever other language you want to use. But in the book, I also can try to trace the process of not only kind of like the basic outrage of like, this is not my Judaism, don't do it in my name, um, and occupation is not my Judaism, and so forth, and now genocide. um, and but also the process of the asking of the, well, what is, which is not the
Right.
same as showing up for the protest for Palestinians. It's connected.
Right.
And so I trace, specifically in the book, I trace the formation of Tzedek Chicago, of this um, congregation community that emerged initially as non-Zionists and values-based, articulated set of values, including rejection of Zionism and solidarity with Palestinians, but other interrelated values, and then shifted after that to being later on to being anti-Zionist after a process of discernment. But the work that you do in the space of this recent community is not the same as the work of the protests and showing up in coalitions.
Right.
Because it's again the movement of Jews for Palestinian dignity and human rights and political freedom is, I mean, it's a part of a broader movement and needs to be understood within that broader movement.
Yeah. Um, so there's an interesting point in there that I kind of want to just do a little bit of historical stuff for the folks listening and stuff you already know, and then to see how this impacts where we are today, especially in places like Tzedek, Chicago, and led by Rabbi Brant Rosen and a whole amazing team of wonderful people. Um, so in the early reform movement, part of, especially in America, right, part of the kind of prophetic analysis had to do with the last line of the Pittsburgh Platform specifically names addressing the like kind of systemic injustices of society that are created by wealth inequality. Basically, it says it very explicitly. And then you jump ahead almost 60 years to the founding of the ACJ. And I just discovered this the other day that in the founding document, they say something, they say a line that's used all the time now that everyone's familiar with in the left now that felt like it came out of nowhere, that our lives are bound up with those of all others. It's not just about Jews. They say this very explicitly in the founding document of the ACJ, which was shocking. They use that exact language. Um, and at this time, right, at both of these times, um, Palestinian liberation wasn't like a major focus for any of these organizations. Even the ACJ at first, it wasn't a major focus. It became one relatively quickly once Rabbis Berger and Lazaron got involved in what was actually happening on the ground in Palestine. But that wasn't what they were focusing on at all. They were more focused on maintaining their form of Reform Judaism. Um, but those um, formations of social justice thinking, even in the time, led to a certain kind of uh, particular organizing of the Jewish world in America around the federations, which were initially organized as mutual aid societies for Jews that needed help with healthcare, food, housing, schooling, whatever, by the wealthy Jews that were already here, primarily for immigrants, right? And that was kind of where that prophetic Judaism landed. And perhaps some argue that that continued throughout the reform movement to some degree, up in civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and things of that nature. Um, and we know in the reform movement writ large, that Palestine has always been the exception, right? That when it came to actual justice work, Palestine was not one of the issues that the reform movement was going to address head on. Um, and from our conversations and from your writing, it seems that you're convinced and truly believe that that Palestinian liberation is specifically generative today for prophetic Jewish revival, as opposed to any of the other causes. And I'd love to hear why you think that is when there is this tradition of other causes being the kind of the 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 generator for the prophetic Judaism.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Really important to have that historical contextualization of the reform and American Judaism in general, because it's shocking how it's forgotten in kind of common discourse. And in many respects, learning about the kind of the layers of the tradition and the history, American Jewish history, but of course, Jews are not only in America. I mean,
Right.
is very, it's very, this is kind of like, this is an important hermeneutical work to do. Look at kind of the different layers of history and the contestations. And so this is very important. Yes, with respect to, I can first say something about, again, my observations and what I've learned from my observations, my findings, in the
Yeah.
language of social science, with the movement of American Jews. And again, one of the big questions, the initial questions that I had, and then I discovered so much more, is what basically, very simply, what makes people change their mind?
Right.
What goes into that? Especially considering how entrenched the Zionist infrastructure is. In terms of education, and of course the broader discourse. Zionism is like the air. Just in the context of them, in American context, and so it's very hard to unlearn it.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that there are over 11 million Christians, members of this one Christian Zionist organization, KUFI, Christian United for Israel, and
Right.
Christian
And that's just the
Zionism.
most extreme one,
This is,
right?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's the United States is a Zionist space.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah, important to underscore. But in my observations of the movement, what really what I saw so deeply is the sense of the urgency with respect to the sense of, well, for many activists, the sense of recognition that actually, hey, we are the bad guys, we're not the good guys. So relinquishing also that sense of victimhood as some sort of like our identity, and have that kind of like power analysis, and which goes back to the issue of being implicated and complicity, and complicity. And there is such a sense of urgency that this is the key issue to deal with, that you cannot have a conversation about Jewish life that is not directly confronting the realities of Jewish power and domination
Mhm.
and violence. And so, and now ever, even more so, because how
Sure.
can we even have a conversation about the Jewish tradition right now and Jewish life without acknowledging the fact that there is a genocide that is happening and that is unfolding, and just in the past 24 hours, over more than 100 people were killed
Yeah.
in Gaza by, um, broadly construed by claims to Jewish safety and, Jewish fulfillment and destiny and whatnot. So so any other issue, and
Mhm.
if this issue is not addressed and put centrally in any effort to rethink, reimagine, reconceptualize, reconfigure Jewish life, Jewish meaning, Jewish institutions. Then we're not, we're not addressing, we're not really wrestling with the historical moment.
Sure.
And the thing is that when you do look historically at the kind of rabbinic hermeneutics, it's always historical.
Yeah.
Um, it's always, you always address your context, and in conversation with, with layers and layers and layers of interpreters. So I can say from the observation, from the movement, that the sense of urgency with respect to the occupation, the denial of Palestinian history, domination over Palestinians, displacement of Palestinians, and that everything is done in the name of Jews, in the name of kind of like Jewish destiny, and Jewish history, and including, how the Holocaust is deployed in this. Um, this has, I mean, what I saw with my interlocutors, that this was so such a critical issue that cannot be just bracketed because it's central.
Yeah.
And also it's connected to everything else. Yes, it's, Israel, Palestine is somewhere else, is not in the US, but in the process, in the mobilization, and this is where the intersectional dimension comes in. There is and analysis of race and racism and racialization and so forth come in, because there is recognition that that the liberation of Palestine is connected to other forms of oppression.
Right.
And so if I mean, there is kind of recognition that if Jews wanted to be a part of the coalition against racism, Black Lives Matter, is very key in that kind of consolidation of this notion. They had to, to connect the dot. They couldn't exceptionalize.
Sure.
It can no longer be except for Palestine. So
Right.
those dots needed to be connected.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think the seating it in its historical moment and like not being able to fully like extract ourselves from this reality that we're living in, um, by choice or not, like we're here, right? Like that's it. Which I think is a very helpful, um, a very helpful framing for like why we have to talk about this, why this has to be a core issue, for everything we do as Jews today. Um, and but I also wonder, not but, and I also wonder that God willing, may it be so very quickly, there is a holistic solution in which Palestine is liberated and the entire region is free and at peace, and reconciliation and reparation is made, and like there's truth is told about the history of Israeli occupation and repression and genocide to the Palestinians, and we make our way to a point of like a true peace, which in this moment feels like, and one day the Messiah will come, yet, and we wait, yet he
Yeah.
continues to tarry. But like God willing, we have to have that vision, or like what else are we fighting for, right? Um, um, if our One of the questions I have is, when we are rooting our Judaism and our Jewishness in this moment so deeply into the battle against the realities that Zionism has enacted in Israel Palestine, without a clear vision as to what Judaism is positively, uh, beyond that conflict, I worry that we get caught up in a reactive bubble that is still within the logic and the narrativization of Zionism. By reacting to Zionism on Zionism's terms, in some ways we may be reifying that, as opposed to constructing a different standpoint from which to battle that cause that is so deeply important. Um, have you seen that happening in any meaningful and like clear way? Do you think it's even possible in this moment?
Yeah. So I mean, this is where I can go back now for the earlier point about how kind of tracing and going deeply into the formation of this new synagogue.
Mhm.
And I say synagogue very consciously, even though Tzedek Chicago uses often the language of denomination or congregation, which are those categories are very Christian categories. So on purpose, I'm saying synagogue. Just want to
Sure.
flag this.
Yeah,
And so it does introduce, it telegraphs what I just said, really telegraphs the fact that that particular development happens within a context that is that of privilege in a sense, of okay, well, it's going to be, a religious community that, yes, is publicly and politically um, aware and articulated, but it doesn't really need to deal with the kind of the messiness of even including, that Jews in the context of Palestine would have to wrestle with,
sure.
as in that scenario that you described, right?
Hmm.
That also is relevant to American Jews. I mean, they cannot just disengage from the kind of process of really wrestling with Zionism as a political and historical reality and what it has done. And so I think in the book, as I mentioned before, I trace how there is the level of protest and like, this cannot happen in my name. This is not my Judaism. What is my Judaism? And then you have a lot of content that goes into that process of, like in Tzedek Chicago as an example, articulating values, reclaiming other kind of formation of Jewish history that is not, a series of catastrophes, one
Right.
catastrophe after another. So there is reclaiming of joy and, Doikite and, all these other traditions and realities, historical realities, deorientalizing Jewish frames by doing this counter archival work, by recognizing how Jews became white and a part of the civilizational discourse, a so-called Judeo-Christian that now we hear Netanyahu talks, with Orban, he talks about the connection along this like Judeo-Christian civilizational, which of course relies on Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. And so I think that it is important to bring a different kind of content and
Yeah.
imagination. I absolutely agree with it. And I think that it already exists
Hmm.
in many, just by, from the ground up. It's not like a vision that can be, that is from top down. This is where it goes to the social pastiche point, the social movement, this um, intersectional and relational space where you from the ground up, people are rescripting what it means to be Jewish, but the rejection of um, of 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 Zionism, the unlearning of Zionism is a key. I mean, and
Sure.
I don't see, and not only that, uh, there cannot be a conceptualization and imagination of another kind of Jewishness that is not implicated in the politics of empire and, a political project that is deeply violent, without wrestling with what, with the process of tshuva.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that by undergoing a process of tshuva, of acknowledgement, kind of restorative process, one is beholden to Zionist frame. I would say that I end the book by highlighting how I mean, a lot of what I can trace ethnographically and through the interviews is kind of the disruption of binaries that comes with the process of unlearning, except, and here I speak from my positionality as someone who is Jewish who grew up in Israel, so I'm Jewish Israeli, that I kind of like emerge with, at the end of the book, with a sense that it's almost too easy to shift to diasporism, um, and say, you know, I don't have nothing to do with, you know, um, with with Israel, or
Sure.
you know, that's just, you know, a mistake, a perversion, and you know, it's not something. Because now it's part of my research. Now I really try to engage with people who are deeply Jewish, deeply rooted in the tradition, in the
Yeah.
context of Palestine Israel Jews, who are reimagining what it means to be Jewish in the space, but not as settler colonial.
Right.
And what resources they draw on, and what does it mean to, for instance, draw on the tradition of on the concept of exile while in the land, and
Yeah.
that there are, you know, historical and theological, for lack of a better word, examples of being in the land and being in exile at the same time. And
Yeah.
that's the process of the critique of understanding how the realities of today are beholden and are predicated on modernity, Christian modernity and coloniality. And so I don't think that you can so I don't think that it's either or. Like, I mean, Zionism
Sure.
has to be central. Like, a critique of Zionism has to be central to the reimagining of what it to creating this other image. The
Yeah.
critique of Zionism.
Yes, yeah, yeah. No, that's thank you. I agree. I was there was a conference at Brown University that was precisely about unearthing these, like, the counter archive of, like, all of the different
Yeah,
forms of
yeah,
non and anti-Zionism from throughout the Jewish world
yeah,
since the advent of Zionism.
mhm,
It was phenomenal.
yeah,
And Adi Ophir is a professor at Brown that helped
yeah,
organize it. And he did say at one point, he said, you can't do non-Zionism
mhm,
until you've gone through anti-Zionism. You
yeah,
have to go through the
yeah,
process of
yeah,
overcoming it
yeah,
before you can really
yeah.
think about building beyond
And I
it.
would add one thing to
Hmm.
Adi Ophir's point, that I don't think that there can be, and this is where, what, something that I learned from engaging with my interlocutors for the book. I mean, you know, as I said, one of my findings, that notion of the relationality, relational ethics,
Hmm.
and that this process has to be informed dialectically by Palestinians. That there can, I really want to make this argument, and I've written about it and continue and especially because now I'm rooted a lot in my current research with Jewish, you know, deeply religious Jewish actors in the context of Palestine, Israel, in the land, that um, that that this process has to be dialectical with Palestinians, or constantly. Um, I mean, this is what it means to do this kind of thinking now.
Yeah.
Um, and what do I, you know, acknowledge? And so a lot, I kind of mentioned it briefly earlier, but what does it mean to wrestle with those horrific traditions of, like, Amalek and all those, like, fantasies of revenge, that are part of the Jewish tradition in the current moment?
Yeah.
And so so those conversations have to happen. It cannot be they cannot be extracted from the historical moment, in my view. Of course, not
Um,
reduced to it,
sure.
but not extracted.
Ooh, I have so many questions that I want to ask with regard to that, but I also recognize we have 10
Yeah,
minutes left and I want to make sure, so I'll
that
just,
was
like,
so
have to
fast.
call you at some point,
Yeah,
and ask you those questions myself.
yeah,
Um, but we've got folks on the Zoom, and I have, up until this point, not allowed you to turn your cameras on or unmute. Um, So I'm now going to let you turn your cameras on if you so desire. You don't have to. And if you would like to ask a question, feel free to either raise your virtual hand or your physical hand, because I can see you, and would love to hear your voices and see if there's anything you'd like to ask. Yeah, Emmett.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. I will admit I read the first like 30 pages of your book at one point and then had to put it down because I'm so deep in my own unlearning process, and it was really painful for me, and I had to take a break. And I've been meaning to pick it back up. But anyways, you mentioned the idea of sort of historical and religious examples of being in exile while being in the land. And I was wondering if you could share any examples of that because I really want to dig into that more, and I'm just not sure where to start.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I will just give you one. If you read Hebrew, actually, it's also there's some material in English, but for now it's just I think in Hebrew mostly. But there is really an incredible Jewish Israeli scholar called Amnon Raz Krakotskine, and he's written a lot. He's written a lot about. He's drawing on Walter Benjamin and the conception um, of history that Benjamin articulates, and also in order to get into the counter archives, the debris of that is in the wake of Zionist history teleology, and kind of that. I mean, Zionism is not only the denial and the negation of Palestinians, not only the denial and negation of the histories of the land itself, the multiple histories of the land, but it's also the negation of the Jewish tradition. And so these are all the kind of so what he does in so I recommend to look at his work, but also specifically there is a book about Safed, this town, yeah,
Mhm.
in the Ottoman Safed in the 16th century that was kind of he kind of gives the history of this town as a form of alternative Jewish modernity, because first you had kind of conversions of Jews from the West and the East, because you have all the Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal were welcomed into the Ottoman Empire. I mean, we don't need to romanticize the Ottoman Empire, but you had the convergence. And also this convergence coincided with print and kind of effort to codify the tradition. So you have all this like massive, works being codified like Shulchan Aruch and Kabbalah. And he talks about how that Safed of this time represents this model that he called the Yad of the Mishnah of the tradition, and not of the Mikra, which is the Zionism of the Bible, which, by the way, the reduction of the Jewish tradition to the Bible. This is where Amnon Raz Krakotskine talks about how Zionism, Jewish Zionism, is a form of the colonization of Jewish consciousness by Christian imagination about the Jews.
Yeah.
And so part of so the people who were sitting and doing this creative, I mean, Safed was this amazing place of learning and production of Jewish learning, and the rabbis who were working there. And of course, it wasn't exactly consistent with the kind of like image of, that Tzedek Chicago has of the feminist and multiracial and, what Judaism of multiple genders and so forth. So, but what is really so generative about looking into that counter archive is that you have, so that they were there in the land,
Mhm.
and yet they were in exile
Yeah.
in their understanding of, you know, um, their, of their Judaism. But then there is a whole, and actually many of those histories are produced by students of this scholar, Amnon Rasker-Kotzkin. So there is kind of like an effort these days of doing history of more recent history of like 19th century Palestine, late 18th century Palestine, people writing, Jewish people in the land, writing and thinking, and and being there in Jerusalem or whatever, but not having this kind of need to put a flag on the Dome of the Rock.
Right.
And so there is kind of that effort of and what is amazing is that people who were like even up until like even in the time of the British who were in Palestine, Jewish thinkers, and there is another scholar, Aviram Tzoref, who writes about that. He writes specifically about this guy Reb Binyamin who is Ashkenazi, who came to Palestine. He was sort of Zionist, but then he was asking, like, wait a second, why are we with the British and not with the other people? Why are we with the empire? And asking those questions. But some of those characters who were really pretty well known at the time are completely like obscured by Zionist historiography. So now there is a process of like digging into, and what I'm interested in is especially how you have the kind of the effort to do this counter history, counter archive work, and then what happens to it in the context of the movement, because people in the context even of Israel, because people are starting to read it and are all of a sudden like thinking, wait a second, why didn't I know about this guy who was pretty famous? So these are some examples, but I want to say something else about Safed was like many other places in Palestine. And again, without romanticizing, I mean, their communities were interwoven. It was, you had like Muslims, sorry, my dog is going crazy, Muslims and Jewish and other people, all those communities. And you see it when you go, you see it in the graveyards. You see all the graves that are still there. But the point is that Safed is completely ethnically cleansed from Palestinians since the Nakba. So yeah, sorry, I went on and on about that, but I'm excited about this material.
Yeah. One thing, and then I want to hear your question, Alana June, too, is one thing just to note is that in Safed is where Isaac Luria was, who is the founder of the level of Kabbalah that everybody knows about with the shattering of the vessels and that exile is from the shattering of the vessels, not from where you are physically. And then one other thing was with the gender question. Actually, like if there was ever a time in Jewish history where God's gender was really up in the air, it was in Safed. Like that was like Luria was very heavily into Shekhinah and the feminine presence of God. And then when we sing, when we sing Lecha Dodi on Shabbat, like welcoming the bride is welcoming the feminine aspect of God in, and that was from Safed too. That was where it was written, which is like there's something there. But sorry, Ilana June. Yes, I'd love to hear your question. Oh, I have to ask you to unmute, don't I? There you go.
Thank you. This conversation has been so nourishing. I am so grateful. I want to say thank you for the definition of prophecy that you offered, or there were many, but particularly the way that prophecy, dislocating it from sort of having a vision and moving it into something that we participate in through our embodied response to what is now, how we create the world that's coming. And I want to say, may it be so. So thank you for that. I am curious if you would be willing to discern how you understand the difference between post-Zionism versus anti-Zionism, particularly as it relates to a spiritual or religious practice. And there's much more I could say about that, but I really want to hear from you, and we're short on time. I'm just curious about your use of your relationship to post-Zionism versus anti-Zionism.
Yeah. I mean, this is it's really complex question, but I think that a lot of the discussion around post-Zionism doesn't really wrestle with the crimes of Zionism, like what I talked about earlier, in a sense of tshuva, centering tshuva, and so often, even in Israeli academics who take on in various sociological debates and so forth the post-Zionism, and often they use, for instance, Edward Said work, but without engaging with what Said is saying with respect to Palestine and what does it mean to think from the perspective of its victims, Zionism from the perspective of its victims. So often you would hear post-Zionist, and I mean, we don't have time to break it down so much, but the scholarly discourse is one thing, and then you hear even settlers, for instance, and I speak a little bit about it in the book, but this is something that I'm now in my current research, I'm really trying to understand deeper. So settlers in the context of Palestine who claim that they're post-Zionist too. And then, and even to those settlers who say, I don't care, like Rabbi Fruman's people, I don't care to be in I can have a Palestinian, passport or whatever, but I want to stay in my home, in my biblical land, and, and so this is deeply problematic from the perspective of, again, the question of what do we owe Palestinians, and what does it mean to do to repair historical injustice? And so, therefore, the anti-Zionism, but also to connect to Rabbi Andy's point, it's like our vision is not just anti-Zionist. So I get the point about staying within the frame, that we want to disrupt the frame, but that it is an important stage, and just by even going to that anti-place, it's a process of it's critical for the process of reimagining in a way that is relational, that it's not just Jews having conversation among Jews about like, oh, we want to be good again, but it's like, we cannot be good again if we don't, engage in tshuva. That's so anyway, I mean, it was kind of impressionistic, but I think it's a very important question. Yeah.
Wonderful. Dr. Omer, thank you so much for this. This has been an incredible hour. I wish that we could keep going, but yes, well, we can do it again. I've put
Inshallah.
yes. I've put Dr. Omer's book in the chat, Days of Awe, the one that we were primarily talking about. She has other books that are more widely wide of scope on religion and nationalism. I also want to hold up this with regard to Safed. This I don't know that you can buy this anymore. It was like a zine that was released. If any
Oh,
of you are
wow.
interested in seeing it, send me an email. You all have my email because you got the invitation to the event. And I can contact the original creators. It's a really beautiful piece about a woman's familial story of what it meant to be ethnically cleansed from Safed, just based on our conversation this evening.
Wow.
So next month, we're going to continue this series with Shaul Magid, who also deals with the issue of anti versus post versus counter Zionism. Tomorrow, inshallah, our new website will be launching with an announcement of our new Intro to Judaism classes, if you are interested in such a thing. And we'll have lots more information about the history of the ACJ. And please, especially if you have to sign up for each in the series. I